Hello, and welcome to my synopsis of the first part of this book, Character Styles by Steven Johnson. This is a book that I would recommend you buy rather than borrow from the library. It really is that good. And one of the reasons I love it is because Johnson invites us to look through people's behaviour with a different lens. And this is to see them as creative adaptations to the environment the child was brought up in. What this does is it breeds a compassion for the client, and it enables us to see the wounded child that is behind that adult presentation. He proposes a characterological developmental theory, which means he takes what is known about personality development and child development, throws the environment into the mix, and when he does this, he provides a map so that people can make a diagnosis and also think about possible interventions. Johnson comes up with some evocative alternative nomenclature for the DSM terms that are used. And I love these terms because it really makes you think about how, when and how, under what circumstances a certain personality developed. And through this, it really does nurture a sense of compassion. So let's take a look at those. Schizoid, the hated child. Symbiotic withdrawal, the abandoned child. Symbiotic character, the owned child. Narcissism, the used child. Masochism, the defeated child. The histrionic, the exploited child. And obsessive-compulsion, the disciplined child. So as you can see, it's already conjured up an image of what this child has gone through, how this child has been treated by its caretakers. Johnson argues that each character comes out of one basic existential need, which needs constant resolution throughout life, but there are going to be periods in life when each one of those needs is heightened. So if one of these needs is experienced as traumatic, it remains unresolved and is repeated. As a therapist, it's crucial to realise that when this resolution of this need came about, this child had limited resources, limited experience, limited cognitive ability, limited physical ability. So this needs to be pointed out to the client at how well they've done, how clever they've been, to have survived at all. However, that learned method of resolution, it becomes fixed, and this isn't helpful. And they need to realise that that fixed way of behaving is not useful today, or perhaps is actually detrimental. The model that Johnson puts forward sort of reconciles psychoanalytic drive theory as well as interpersonal theory. So what he's saying is that people have drives, they are driven, they have impulses for certain needs, and how they're resolved depends upon those needs and also upon the environment's ability to respond to those needs. So we're talking here about Bowlby's attachment theory, we're talking about Stern and Winnicott's ideas, the idea that we are object-seeking. So it is a really good way of seeing the environment and how it interacts interpersonally and also with different drives that the child has. So what we're talking about here is the child expresses a need. It might be a need to individuate, as Marla talks about. And so the child expresses this need and tries to individuate. And then this need is responded to by the environment, and perhaps this child is frustrated. So that response is going to have an effect on the child, and then the child is going to respond in a certain way, and then the environment in turn is going to respond to that response. So what I'm going to show you here is how we can split up this process in 5 different stages, which I'll go through now. So the first stage is self-affirmation. This is the initial expression of the need. Then we have negative environmental response. The organismic reaction. This is the hardwired reaction to number 2, and this could be something like grief, rage, or fear. Then we have self-negation. This is imitating the environment to block steps 1 and 3. Then we have the adjustment process. That's the compromise to resolve the unresolvable, or as Winnicott calls it, the false self. If we have a look at 4 in more detail, this is what must be denied or suppressed. This identification causes the internal conflict and leads to psychopathology, which can last a lifetime. Fairbairn suggests that these original instincts were object-seeking. When these were frustrated, the child internalized them, and their own response and rendered them unconscious. It is these fixed internal object relations which makes them so resistant to change and make them unconscious. The resistance is not just to protect the client from re-experiencing the original pain, but also to keep an attachment with the caregivers, which was so important for the vulnerable child's survival. Therefore, this self-negation is relational and part of the survival instinct. This will give you an idea of why people hold on to their ways of behaviour so tenaciously, because it is a survival instinct. If we look at 5, this is what must be exaggerated, what parts are denied, and which are exaggerated. This defines the character, and it's there to avoid the pain whilst maintaining contact. So again, this is relational. The response is relational. It's all about maintaining contact. Johnson divides the characterological issues into 3 different ones. We'll take a look at those now. He talks about attachment and bonding. Now, in this phase, if there is an issue which isn't resolved in a non-traumatic way, you can get oral and schizoid issues coming out of that. Then the child moves into a period of self-other development. So we're talking a dyad here. So you can get symbiotic, narcissistic, or masochistic issues. Then thirdly, when the child's a little older, he learns how to walk, meets more people, you have self-insistem, and you get the histrionic and obsessive-compulsive issues stemming from these. Johnson also talks about high, low and medium functioning people. And what this means, what it highlights actually, is that a child isn't just going to have one issue. Well, if they're lucky, they may just have one issue, but usually there's quite a few. So they could, say, have had an issue with attachment, and then they could also have had an issue with self and system. However, they may be high functioning on one of those dimensions and low functioning on another one of those dimensions. He also looks at each of these dimensions as a continuum. So if we look at one part of the continuum, there will be a personality disorder. So the person may be masochistic as defined by DSM. Or the person may have a neurosis. So they're quite well functioning, but they have issues. Maybe these issues become heightened during periods of stress. And then at the other end of the continuum, the person may just have a flavour. So they may have a flavour of masochism. And then it also suggests that that person can move up and down the scale depending on what else is happening in their life. An important point to mention is that Johnson points out that when you're looking at DSM terminology as compared to what he presents in this book, you need to remember that DSM starts with behaviours, whereas what Johnson is doing is looking at etiology. The first needs a child has is to attach to a caregiver and to bond. So these are the earliest issues that we see. That's the schizoid and the oral, and they present very, very early on. I'm going to first take a look at the schizoid issue and then I'll move on to the oral. There is a great deal of research that shows that children are hardwired for social interaction. And from a very young age, they know, are they being handled in a hostile way or a nurturing way? And they have mechanisms to cope with this. And it's important to realise that when I say hostile, I'm not talking about child abuse or anything deliberate. It could really just be that misattunement that Stern talks about. And the mechanisms we're talking about, again, they could be something as simple as the child turning her face away or crying, pulling a face. And what happens here is the child learns a certain coping mechanism. And then in later years, that child, when faced with a situation which they perceive as similar to that, may then use similar coping mechanisms. But again, we have to think about how is that translated. A child, an infant, may turn her face away, but then how will someone of 25 replicate that? It could be driving away, it could be running away. So we do have to extrapolate that behaviour into what that adult is now capable of. So what Johnson is saying is that people generalise their experiences, and when they experience any situation, they use those coping mechanisms that they learned in infancy. Johnson's theory then predicts for the schizoid that person, when they grow up, they can isolate themselves. And this is not just a physical isolation, it can be a mental isolation. So we've got a mental or physical isolation when that person picks up hostility in the environment. So how does this theory fit with the clinical observations that many schizoids are harsh with themselves? And they also end up in harsh relationships sometimes as well. Johnson explains this by the self-negation process I mentioned in the last video. So there is an imitation of the caregiver and an internalisation of this to preserve the child-caretaker bond. This self-other relational model is then used as a template for future relationships. The pattern is therefore both interpersonal and intrapersonal. So what will psychotherapy look like with a schizoid person? Johnson predicts that there'll be lots of projection. The client will see hostility where there is none. So you need to be ready for that. But the client will also experience very real harshness because they may have gravitated towards a harsh relationship. One of the reasons they do this is that in those harsh relationships they're comfortable. Their coping mechanisms are actually appropriate there. So in these harsh environments, their coping mechanisms are actually appropriate. In low-functioning individuals, the person may dissociate and withdraw very easily and very quickly, whereas in higher-functioning individuals, you may see intellectualization and spiritualization. You may pick up an element of terror, and the person is terrified. And that's the memory. As I said before, we're not talking always of deliberate child abuse here. But if you think of an infant, maybe a 5-day-old infant, if they experience coldness in how they've been handled, then that is very, very terrifying. And that, again, it really picks out that survival instinct that they know without a caregiver, how will they survive? So in a therapeutic setting, what are you going to see? A client who is out of touch with their feelings, out of touch with thoughts, including visual memories, and an angry person. It is this separation of thoughts and feelings which keeps them safe. Successful therapy would work around sort of desensitizing that person for getting true intimacy. It's intimacy which terrifies this person. It's about turning down the harshness of their evoked companion and teaching them how to get a real loving relationship rather than in a relationship where there is constant projected hostility and then these probably equally as negative coping mechanisms. Timing is essential. Do not jump in too quickly or you will frighten that client away. It's too close. It is a softly approach. And on the other hand, if you're more sort of inclined towards CBT methods or you're quite a distant person yourself, make sure you don't end up colluding with the client and keeping a distance. The therapy will be slow, and if you feel impatient, just remind yourself as to how terrified this child has been when they did try and be close to somebody, when they did want that intimacy, and what they got in return. I'll now move on to the oral issue. So the oral issue sort of looks at need and dependency, and DSM would call these dependent personality disorder or codependent. The term oral comes from the observations that one of the first things an infant does is to feed, to need that nutrition, they touch their mouths. However, it's now used quite metaphorically. So we're not thinking so much about the mouth, but the very early existential issue of the self-other relationship. Clients who present with an oral issue have a history of deprivation and unreliability. Their relationships bear a distinct one-up, one-down feel, and their defences are quite primitive. The parents of the client often have issues that would prevent them giving the child the care and attention they need. So we're looking at parents who may be alcoholic or depressed, or it could be through times of war or other such trauma. The interesting thing is that this is also replicated in the child who normally abhors their own neediness and denies their needs. High-functioning clients will demonstrate a great deal of caretaking of others. Johnson suggests that this behaviour may serve to maintain contact with a gratifying environment, to experience need gratification vicariously, to fix the other so that that fixed person can then gratify the oral person. Just after the most primitive defences of denial and projection come identification and displacement and reversal. And it's due to these defence mechanisms that we see the characteristics I've just mentioned. Primitive caretaking takes place very early. Once there is a block in the need impulse, it is very difficult to change this. Perhaps this is due to the thought that if the need is felt again, then that person will be faced with the same disappointment, which was so difficult to bear before. There is also sometimes a belief if they don't meet the needs and care for others, then that person will abandon them. So again, we're going back into that survival instinct. And the script decisions of these people are do not need. If I need, I will be abandoned. My needs are too great and will overwhelm others. This life of giving without receiving is untenable. And sometimes you'll see people with oral characters collapsing because of all the effort they're putting into looking after others. Sometimes that leads to a collapse in the person. And what happens then is when that person is ill, physically ill, then they get taken care of by others. So it's a lot more culturally acceptable to be taken care of when you're ill. So this may be a way of getting that care that they so desperately crave. The oral character is typically grandiose and feels omnipotent, that they can take care of other people and sometimes even the whole world. And you'll get this feeling from them that they can actually take care of everybody. And this is their false representation. She's out of touch with her own natural aggression. And sometimes you see this as complete passivity. And sometimes that aggression seeps through and you see it as a chronic irritability. This is the anger and the grief that you're seeing here with that irritability at having to give up being a child so prematurely and beginning to care for the people who should have been taking care of her. So what does it feel like to be with someone with oral issues in the clinical setting? Well, your client is going to want to take care of you. She's also going to expect you to reciprocate that care. So there's a lot of pressure there. But as you give to that person, you may start getting the feeling that however much you give is just not quite enough. And in a way, this is completely justifiable, because what that individual is looking for is what she didn't get as an infant, and you can't give that. For the client to realise that they are not going to get what they didn't get as a child, that is an important part of the therapy. And there's a lot of grief around that. However, what they can go on to see is that they do have needs which they can get as an adult, needs which they have the right to have met. But they need to be fulfilled within an adult relationship in the here and now. To do this, they first need to let go of that fear of being disappointed, rejected, and abandoned. There needs to be a real mourning over what has been lost, and a real unpicking and a real expression of all the rage that surrounds this. In the third chapter of this book, Johnson looks at the issues around which underlie the development of a clear, separate identity. So what comes out of this stage will be narcissistic, masochistic, and the symbiotic issues. These are typically seen where children have been used by their caretakers to fulfill their own agendas. The child therefore becomes confused between who they are and who their parents are. And that's where you see a real self, false self. The child becomes confused between his real self and the false self he has been forced to become in order to keep that connection with his caretakers. The real self is stifled, is a developmental arrest, whereas the false self continues to grow. And this is just my own point of view here, not Johnson's, but it's when I read about these three particular issues that I'm reminded of Bison's theory of change, and how when you become what you are rather than what you think you should be, that real change actually can take place. I'll first take a look at the symbiotic issue. Johnson begins by talking about Stern's idea of the evoked companion, and how for some of the time the child relates with real external people, and a lot of the time relates to that internal evoked companion. There is a continuous silent dialogue between the two to get that real feeling of being with somebody else. When a child learns how to walk and talk, issues of separation become emphasised. Children constantly want to explore, so they move away from the parent, but they keep on turning around, checking back, making eye contact with the parent to make sure that being there or moving further away is safe. If the parent signals that there's danger by getting up, moving the child, or an expression on their face or verbally, the child senses the danger and then comes running back. What is important to realise is that danger may not be a danger to the child. It may be a danger to the parent. The mere fact that the child is separating, that may be perceived as being dangerous to the parent. In these circumstances, what a child will do is block their impulses to go and explore. They'll suppress these, because it's more important to keep that link with the parent and keep that parent happy than that need to go and explore. The child develops a compromised false self. Identity is therefore found in that closeness with the caregiver rather than in being a separate individual and exercising autonomy. The symbiotic character struggles to express herself, struggles to know what she likes, what she doesn't like, what her opinions are. She usually idealises other people. There's an over-identification and a real idealisation of others. Her script decisions are, I'll be safe as long as I hold on to you. I will be helpless if I let go. They are dependent, clinging, complaining. A common theme you'll see in therapy is the client's aggression around issues of separation. Try and point out the links between the person's cognitions, emotions and behaviours, and how these work together to try and preserve the relationship. The narcissistic issue. Now, this is all around self-esteem. It's a lot more complex than the symbiotic issue that we just talked about. And again, it does come from frustration around self-expression. But it's not about separation. This time, it's something about the child being too much or too little for the caretaker. And a reconstruction of a narcissistic character's childhood can show one, two, or a combination of these two scenarios. One is repeatedly being put down or shamed for expressing the self, and being idealised such that she is given high expectations. Now, you may wonder, these two things are totally opposite. How can one child experience both of these? However, parenting isn't consistent. Many parents behave differently at different times. They may behave differently in private to when they have company around them. But also remember, many people have two parents, two caretakers, and it could be that one person idealises the child, then the spouse compensates for this by putting that child down. Now, this could be because they may feel some kind of jealousy between their spouse and the child, or it could be they think they're genuinely doing the right thing. They don't want their child to be big-headed. So the narcissistic injury may be around that child never quite being able to live up to these really high standards that have been set for them. Or it may be around the constant humiliations. So they live with these polarities where you've got worthlessness on one side and extreme grandiosity on the other side. Now, when children are growing up, they often express their magnificence. They may say, "Look at me, I can jump from this wall." Or they may express their limitations, which could be, I don't think I can do this. And what usually happens is that the parent will encourage them where appropriate or hold them back where appropriate. Now, if this doesn't happen, then that child has no idea of their boundaries or their limits, where their magnificence or their limitations are being talked about. What these children may sometimes do is to suppress those parts of themselves that are not met by praise, whereas the parts which are praised and encouraged, they become overly inflated. You do not need to be a psychologist to know a narcissist. It is probably the most blatant structure there is. It is characterised by gross levels of grandiosity, entitlement, objectification of others, a devaluation of others, and interpersonally, as Johnson says, these people are disastrous. These are the clients who, when they ring you up, will ask, what class of degree did you get? Which university did you go to? When they walk into the room, they will assess your furniture, how much it cost, where you got it from. Have you written any books? Have you written any articles which have been published? It is actually quite easy to dislike these people. But what Johnson does very cleverly is to invite you to focus on the other pole, the pole that that person is trying to protect themselves from. And that is that terrifying fear of that utter worthlessness. That is why they have to hold on to the other pole so tightly and to exaggerate it so much. This person feels so bad about his real self that he has to cling on to this false one. The high-functioning narcissist is very successful. They'll be very good at their jobs. They will be charming. They will be witty. They will also be manipulative. Everyone around them is their audience. And that gives a feeling of something being not quite real about the relationship. Not quite real, not quite sincere what they're saying. And if you're in a close relationship with this person, there is a quality of, this is just too good to be true. And actually it is. Because after this kind of idealizing that you'll receive from these people, there will be an incredible come down where you will feel as devalued by them and as objectified by them as a minute ago you were feeling so idealized by them. These people are hypersensitive to criticism, and they will see it everywhere. And any sort of disapproval in the environment will be met with an anger. Therapy will involve teaching them how to use other people to bolster their true self, rather than using people to constantly support and grow this false self. And also spend some time getting the client to realise that being human involves success, failure, sometimes being weak, sometimes even being a little bit stupid, and that is all okay. And it'll also focus on the fact that there's a healthy level of narcissism, which is good for people to have. It's healthy to be able to say, you know what, I just did a really good job. And to be able to praise yourself and to expect praise from others where it is genuinely appropriate. Now this part is about the masochistic issue. This issue is about control. And Johnson starts this chapter in a very profound way. He asks us to imagine what it would be like to take an animal, like a cat or a dog, and to force it to eat when you want to, and to force it to defecate when you want it to force it to drink, to force it to sleep, all according to what you want. Pretty terrifying thought. But what you would expect in an animal is actually what you can see, as he then says, in humans who have been subjected to extreme levels of this type of control. He then equally as evocatively relates a story of a client who had talked about how as a child his mother used to chase him around the house with a spoon of food in one hand and a belt in the other, threatening to kill herself if he didn't eat more food. She would also force him to sit on the toilet, expecting him to do something for several hours, and if he didn't, she would insert her fingers to force a bowel movement. So you can see this isn't just telling someone to tidy their room. This is looking at really personal aspects about a person. Things like their eating, their sleeping, how they use the toilet, how often they use it. This is looking at it's what the control has been exerted over, which is important here, as well as the level of control. So it's very intrusive. This is intrusive and controlling, and that's how you get a masochistic issue. What's important to note here that at some point during these child-parent battles, the child's will would have been broken. There is a real inertia to move, to change. These are people who need to suffer and need other people to suffer with them. They are difficult to help, and the helper, that's you, are going to be on the receiving end of quite a lot, I should think, of passive aggression. There is an absence of joy, of trust, and a real disillusionment of the world. Be prepared. Any improvement is usually quickly followed by a relapse. What's this about? Perhaps you're being punished. Perhaps it's due to distrust. But it needs careful exploration. And what you might find is that you might respond quite negatively to these constant relapses which of course, if you let out a little bit of anger or frustration, the client is then going to be completely justified in distrusting you in the first place. So again, it's a little bit like the battle of wills between that parent and child. When that client's distrust is justified, there will be a release of all that suppressed anger, which may be what that client wanted anyway. The script decisions are pleasure is a sin, and to be careful, because you shouldn't trust anyone, you may get tricked. Several decades ago, when parenting was more punitive, this issue was a lot more common. Now it isn't that common. Do not take the retaliations personally, but really explore the internalized bad objects and recognize behaviors as natural responses to having their natural biological impulses controlled so severely. Johnson goes on to talk about the self in system. So before we talked about dyads, but now things are more complicated. Not only are more people involved, but also the issues that arise now interact with any issues that came up previously. The characters associated with this period of development are the histrionic and the obsessive-compulsive. Now, the histrionic character, which used to be called hysteria, and is usually more common in women, whereas obsessive-compulsives are usually men, it comes from an inappropriate encouragement of rivalry and sexuality, whereas with the obsessive-compulsive, this comes from a punishment of the same expressions. A point to note that obsessive compulsion does have several different etiologies, and in the disorder, which is mentioned in DSM, it could be due to a neurological condition. But obsessive-compulsive behaviour can come from a situation where caretakers have provided no kind of structure whatsoever, so the child had to invent their own very strict structure. So if we start with the histrionic, and we call it, or Johnson calls it, the Oedipal issue, not so much in the way that Freud talks about it, but in the fact that there's more than a dyad, so we're talking triad and more. So people who present with this issue, they sometimes have histories where the mother is quite cold and distant, whereas the father is quite infantile. To say that the father is infantile and sexually infantile doesn't suggest that he is sexually abusing that child. It could be something like expecting her to sit on his lap or encouraging her to sit on his lap when she's quite old. I mean, she could be 18, 19, 20 years old, and he may encourage her to sit there. Or it could be something like encouraging the girl to come and share his bed again when she's about 14, 15, 16, or going to lie with her in a completely innocent way. But there are, there's a strange feeling in there that these things are not appropriate. Or we may have situations where husband, wife and child are going out to a restaurant, and the father may ask the daughter to choose where they're going, or that kind of thing. It's sort of elevating her to that partner status. The family of the histrionic is quite interesting. They will deny what's happening. The whole structure of the family is set up to make this strange behaviour between the father and the daughter normal, and they'll use a lot of cognitive distortion to prove that. Caught in the middle, the daughter will really have to work hard to separate her thoughts and her emotions to prevent herself from getting caught up in all this. You may see that the client immerses herself in a non-factual world, or is unable to concentrate for long periods of time. And this is accompanied by an emotional overreactivity, which sort of draws the other person to take care of her. She comes across as childlike and helpless. And this person may gravitate towards partners who is seen as an authority figure and will be able to take care of her. So this could be an older man or a very wealthy man. These relationships may have an as-if quality, something not quite right. And she'll also probably not have very many female friends. Successful therapy will involve inviting her to experience real intimacy, where she can be who she is without the sexuality and without the rivalry. Now, the obsessive-compulsive. This, as I've said earlier, is more common in men. And here there are warnings and conditions and instructions that are constantly being given to that client. And as you've probably guessed, this is an unassimilated other. These individuals may have experienced parents as being rigid and cold. Parents who have been maybe threatened by the child's success. Or perhaps the parents have found the child's aliveness, animal-like quality, that freeness, is a really disgusting thing. And they have tried to control their children. These parents wanted the perfect little son or daughter, and instead they get quite an alive, autonomous little child. So the etiology of this is like we said before, what the child sees on the outside, they introject this, and they then, for the rest of their life, have to follow these life-defying targets and rules and principles. And then they become focused on all these, and then all that aliveness, all that freeness that was in them, that's suppressed. And the child does all this in order to maintain contact with that parent. And as I mentioned just earlier, that what tends to happen is that the parent maybe have that obsessive-compulsive issue themselves, somewhere along the continuum, and the child can assimilate this. So it's one of those issues, characteristics, where it can go down from parent to child very easily. But this obsessive compulsion, there are so many etiologies that this could come from. And Johnson talks about a particular one where if the child has a very fragile sense of self, they will need to have these compulsions, obsessive compulsions, but then it's not seen in the same way as just earlier, but it's seen as a protection. So it's not a defence, it's a protection to keep themselves intact. So what does it feel like to be this person? Well, Johnson likens it to having a spotlight on you the whole time, so that everyone's watching your every move. So you can see and really empathise with how difficult it is to put a step wrong when you feel that the whole world is watching just you, your every move. And you can also see how difficult it is to be spontaneous when you're trying to do everything correctly by the rules. These people show a great attention to detail. And you can see that if you do that, it's quite difficult to mix your cognition and your emotion together. It does keep the anger in check when you're just finely focused on one part of what you're doing. And it's this preoccupation with the minutiae of the task which keeps that person from getting close to other people. So the emotions here are quite suppressed. We are talking very, very cognitive. So the social behaviour of this character style is just as controlled as everything else they're going to do. So with that preoccupation with the how do I greet someone, how do I entertain them, what do I cook, how do I stand, when the person is preoccupied with this, they can't really get engaged with others and really enjoy their company. And this is what other people will say who have relationships with people with obsessive compulsions, is that there is no real engagement. The person seems preoccupied, distant, and in their head. All this suppression and this lack of engagement may lead to depression. And it may also lead to hostility seeping out. And I remember a client of mine who presented with obsessive compulsion, and what she would do is deliberately trip people over on the train. So it looked like she hadn't done anything wrong, there was no one to point a finger at her, but she still managed to show other people how angry she was. There is perfectionism you will see with the obsessive-compulsive, but it's not like the perfectionism that we saw with the narcissist. Now, with the narcissist, the perfectionism is there in order to maintain that illusion of grandiosity, to keep them away from that feeling of their worthlessness. Now, for the obsessive-compulsive, the perfectionism is there as a control mechanism to control their feelings. Basically, so it dampens them down. That's what's important to these people. So when you experience these different types of perfectionism, with the narcissist, the perfectionism is going to be accompanied with some hostility maybe. However, with someone with obsessive compulsions, there will be a much more defensive attitude around that perfectionism. Johnson emphasises that for the obsessive compulsive, following all these rituals is there not just to ward off criticism, although that is a part of it, but the main part of it is not to be isolated from the family, not to be shunned by the family, and be able to keep that contact with the parents. In therapy, you'll find that these clients tend to intellectualize a lot. They're very much in their head, and you're going to have to encourage them to get in touch with their feelings really, really slowly, because that will provoke anxiety. And it's about desensitizing them to this anxiety and getting them to realize that those worries they had as a child, they're not there anymore. Again, be alert to how you behave. You will scare them off or they probably just won't understand you if you have your therapy sessions full of feelings. But by the same token, don't intellectualize yourself too much, or you will end up colluding with the client. Now, I'm just going to show you a chart which I've made up, which talks about the different, it's sort of a summary which you can keep and look at to remind yourself about these different character styles. So here is the chart for the symbiotic character. Etiology. The parents block self-agency, adventure, and self-control by anxious, withdrawn, or punitive responses. Consequently, you get an identification with and dependency on parents. This results in an other determined self. Symptoms. Lacks a solid sense of self and identity. Identity is found in relationships. This lack of firm boundaries can lead to fears of being engulfed by the other and leads to a distancing. This then leads to fears of abandonment. Cognition. The boundary confusion. This leads to poor reality testing in terms of who is responsible for what. This results in a lot of blaming. In higher functioning people, this can lead to an exaggerated responsibility for others. They may have difficulty working out their own opinions and others. Aggression is denied and projected onto others. Defences. You see merger, denial, manipulation, and omnipotent responsibility. Script decisions. I can't tolerate difference between us. I can't survive without you. Your success, which does not include me, hurts me. Self-representation. This depends on the connection with the other. Object relations. Others are seen as overly important, with self-other blurring. Others are experienced as engulfing or abandoning. Affect. Anxiety at anything that leads to separation. difference of opinion, etc. Panic or anger at thoughts of abandonment or engulfment. Excessive responsibility for others. This is the chart for the obsessive-compulsive. Etiology. Rigid parenting where the child is encouraged to control impulses through punishment and reinforcement. The obsessions and compulsions maintain control by keeping away the emotions. Symptoms. A driven tension to do the correct thing. Spontaneity, choice and genuine affect is absent. Perfectionism, procrastination, depression, hostile intrusive thoughts, obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviours. Cognitive style. Intense focused attention to detail whilst missing the essential detail. This business overwhelms cognition, so it's less likely to have impulsive thoughts. Separation of thoughts and feelings. Doubt surrounds even simple activity. Defences. Rumination, rituals to inhibit the impulses, and a rigid posture. Script decisions. I must control myself or I will lose all control. I must have done something wrong. Self-representation. Consciously sees himself as working hard to be correctly behaved, but unconsciously feels he has done something wrong and that this transgression must never be repeated. Object representations. Others are seen as the authority figure and himself as a subordinate or vice versa. Power struggles are common, especially where roles are not clearly defined. They lack meaningful connection, get frustrated with the unnecessary pressure that is created. Affect. Little access to feelings, anxiety, a separation of thoughts and feelings so that highly positive or negative thoughts do not produce the usual emotional impact. Now here's the masochistic character table. Etiology. Controlling and intrusive parents, often surrounding eating and toilet habits. May seem docile with underlying passive aggression. Symptoms. Self-deprecating, self-defeating behaviour, chronic depression. Cognitive style. Low-grade depression dulls cognition. Unimaginative. Defences. Denial, projection, identification with the aggressor, holding back of distrusted bodily impulses. Script decisions or pathogenic beliefs. I give up. I will be good. Deprivation will hurt you more than it hurts me. Self-representation. Sees the ability to endure pain as an admirable quality. Lacks spontaneity. Claims to want more adventure but pleads that she doesn't know how. Uninspiring. Object relations. Seeks to make contact by complaining and being of service. The service will be guilt-inducing and joyless. Deprives herself of satisfaction in order to deprive another of satisfaction. Affect. Restrained, muted, depressed, guilt at perceived obligation failures, feels victimised, is out of touch with their own aggression, but others will be well aware of it. It's the histrionic chart. Etiology. At least one parent uses the child as a sex object. Symptoms. Overly emotional, dramatic behaviour, shallow emotional experience, and sexualised relationships. Cognitive style. Emotionally dominated thought. Cognitive style. Emotions dominate thought. Absence of factual detail and reality-based discrimination. Script decisions. Sex and rivalry are bad. If I love fully, I will be exploited, shamed. or hurt my parents. All gratification comes from the opposite sex. Defences: denial, dissociation, repression, global thinking. Object representations: unconscious competition with people of the same sex, relationships sexualized and characterized by superficial role-playing, themes of victimization, nurturing and helplessness. Affect: shallow as if affects are overly dramatic, unconscious hostility and competitiveness. The narcissistic character. Etiology: the child is used to fulfill the ambitions of the parent. The child's real magnificence and vulnerability is not supported. Parents need the child to be more than or less than she is. Symptoms: a grandiose false self with an excessive reliance on achievement, manipulation, objectification and devaluing of others. When the compensatory false self breaks down, see great vulnerability to shame, humiliation and feelings of worthlessness. This low self-esteem may be accompanied by hypochondria, psychosomatic illness, anxiety and loneliness. Cognition: cognitive distortion to maintain the grandiosity, for example, blaming others. Disavowal of own negative attributes and others' positive ones. In the collapsed state, there are ruminations of self-worth, procrastination, preoccupation with mental and physical symptoms. Script decisions: I must not make a mistake or I am worthless. All that I own, including my family and friends, must reflect or confirm my superiority. Others are superior to me. Others are inferior to me. I will never be humiliated again. Self-representation: split, grandiose and worthless as above. Object relations: best understood using Cohort's transferences. 1. Merger: uses another without recognition of the self-other boundary to feel secure. 2. Twinship: achieves enhanced self-worth by exaggerating similarities with another. 3. Mirroring: relates to another solely to receive prizing. 4. Idealization: the other is used to enhance self-esteem. The other usually feels used. Affect: their feelings feel artificial. There is an inability to feel for others and their pride is easily wounded. At low functioning levels, impulse control problems are common.